All right. This is our 67th lesson on the biblical flood. We're in chapter 16 of the second edition of the book. I'm Marion Fox teaching the class, and we'll be looking here tonight at some more suggested studies to follow up and do more research in this area. We're going to look at woolly mammoths. We've already looked at them to a certain extent. We're going to look some more at them, at some things that are recently being done and what might result from it. And we're going to look at the fact that there's been evidence that's been ignored. I don't know whether it's just been overlooked and they didn't see it or they just ignored it. But I think they ignored it. I think there's evidence that was ignored. There are what we call polystrate fossils that were ignored. And I believe we'll see evidence of that. All right. Arthropoda and flooding. I don't think there were insects and arthropods on the ark. I don't think they were on the ark, like scorpions and spiders and things like that were necessarily on the ark. These arthropods and insects are a subdivision of arthropods. I think there's probably some evidence, and it needs to be studied further, about their eggs maybe surviving the flood itself. We also want to look a little more at the tiny comet trajectories. They're doing more work on this that we looked at earlier. And we'll look at that just a bit. And then we'll look at dinosaur DNA. They've been discovering DNA that they claim is dinosaur DNA. So we'll try to be looking at that a little bit. The woolly mammoths, we found them quick frozen so that even their internal organs haven't decayed. Hapgood, in his book, which was endorsed by Albert Einstein, that doesn't necessarily make it correct, but it does have some high-powered endorsement. I think we need to do some additional research and see what happens in the next few years. They're getting more and more rapidly. They're working in this area on the ability of elephants to survive in cold climates. Hapgood claimed they couldn't. Of course, Hapgood makes in pages 249 to 257 of his book. I have two books by Hapgood, so this is one of those books. I'm sorry I don't have which one here. He makes several arguments designed to prove that mammoths were not adapted to cold climates. So Hapgood does. I watched a program on TV on one of the learning channels on elephants, and they claim that young elephants sometimes die in Africa when the temperature gets too cool because they're not adapted to cold climates. And if mammoths were not adapted to cold climates, the traditional theory of ice ages is totally unsound. We have other problems we've already pointed out with the mammoths. An elephant, African elephant, a full-size African elephant, eats about 600 pounds of food every day. They don't digest a very high percentage of what they eat. They get a lot of forage and it runs through their system, and they defecate it out. So they'll eat maybe 600 pounds of leaves and limbs and things like that every day, and defecate it out. So they take a lot of things in, and in the tundra, you can't get 600 pounds or thousands or tens or hundreds of thousands of mammoths eating that much every day. There's just not that much material there for them to eat. That's a problem with it. We've already pointed that out. But here, if mammoths are not adapted to cold climates, you say, well, how are we going to know? Well, we're going to see that in the next slide or two. And link has an option for how elephants deal with cold weather. Now, elephants, this is an Elephant Aid International trying to keep elephants from becoming extinct, and I sure hope they don't become extinct. But what we have here, this deals with and shows that elephants cannot handle cold climate. We have two basic kinds of elephants, African and Asian elephants, and there's subdivisions of each of those groups, but neither one of the groups can survive cold climate. So the elephants we have and none of the elephants that we have can handle cold climates. None of them can. Now, of course, the atheists, agnostics, and or the old Earth creationists will claim that the mammoth is a variety of elephant that was adapted, and they'll argue about macroevolution to cold climates. That's the argument they're going to make. And of course, we can't prove otherwise because we don't have any living mammoths. This is where the question, and we need to watch this, comes to bear. A professor at Harvard University, his name is George Church, is planning to revive mammoths. And Professor Church is trying to bring back the mammoths. Here's a link to it, and you can follow this up and get more information. We're not going to go off and look at a whole bunch of this stuff, but he's trying to bring them back, and he's telling how he's going to do it. He thinks he can have it done in the next 5 or 6 years. What they're going to do is they're going to take the DNA from some mammoths that were frozen and use them in, and I don't know whether they're going to clone them or they're actually going to put them into mammoths, other living elephants. And I think they're going to use the Asian elephant because it appears to be closer DNA-wise to than the African elephant. If the mammoth that he restores, and he thinks he can have this done in about 4 or 5 years, maybe 6 years, if it cannot handle and live in cold climates after he gets it restored, then the atheist view of mammoths is flawed. There's another link to his plans. He's with Harvard University, and you can go to this link. Of course, this will be put on the internet. You just pause it and write this down and go to the link. You can follow up with other links to this as well. If it revives mammoths, and they're not tolerant of cold climates, this is going to create a crisis in the interpretation of ice ages by geologists. This will be a crisis. I don't have a problem with it at all. But they certainly will. Now, any questions or comments before we move on? Okay. Now, this is something you can follow up and do more surfing the web yourself with it. Additional research needs to be done on the question of whether or not archaeologists have ignored evidence that demonstrates that the atheistic interpretation of archaeology is flawed. I believe they've ignored evidence. I believe they've had the evidence and ignored it. Cremo, which I cite, who is not a Christian, and he is a microevolutionist. So it's not one of ours, that's one of our people, theist, that's making this claim. There are a number of theists that make this claim, but I chose him because he's not a Christian. And he doesn't even believe in the God of the Bible, as far as I know. Cremo makes extensive claims that evidence has been ignored. He cites several sources. Evidence already been provided that the atheists tend to ignore evidence when it contradicts their worldview, their view of things. Just ignore the evidence. In fact, they even admit that they do it. We have sites of them where they admit that they ignore the evidence or just completely overlook it, ignore it. A number of fossils have been found that are in several layers of strata of rock. Example of one right here. And we've already looked at this before, but right here you notice where my mouse is moving around. That's a little hammer that they would use for chipping things out. Here is a tree trunk going up through all these layers of rocks that supposedly took millions of years to lay. Well, a tree trunk would have rotted away long before this happened. So the tree trunk is fossilized here. Yes, but what we have here is it goes up through the layers. So this tells me that these layers were laid pretty quickly. This fits the flood model. It doesn't fit the long-term, slow, uniformitarian geologic system. Questions or comments? We've already looked at this, but there are a number of these, and you can see how big it is. There are how many layers of rock it goes through. The previous slide is explained here as in situ or in place. Like Copsid, probably Sigillaraia, with attached stigmatarian roots. So let's go back and look at the roots. The roots right down here going down into these rocks, okay, going down further. So we see the roots. This may be a root over here as well, going down. So the roots of this were in the soil, and then it's made into rock. And it's from the Joggins Formation of Nova Scotia, Cumberland Basin, Nova Scotia. And here's another one. You can see that going up in the middle right here, going up. And there's a hammer or a chisel that they would use, probably about the size of a regular carpenter's hammer. This is upright stigmaria and dipping beds of Pennsylvania Lyellian Formation on Bear Valley Strip Mine in Northumberland County, Pennsylvania. This is taken in 1998. So we have this occur from this strip mine. And now here's some more Polystrate fossils. We see here, here, and here, trees growing up right through the rocks. Well, tree trunks won't do that. So again, that right there tells you these rocks were laid very quickly. These layers of rocks were laid quickly, not slowly. Out there, 3 trees in situ, and that's just in place. They're in place. These polystrate fossils are not mentioned in many recent geology textbooks. They just ignore them completely because they don't fit their scenario, their way of viewing things there. And so why are they not mentioned? We ask the question. It appears that the atheistic and agnostic and the old earth geologist has ignored, or they have ignored the evidence that demonstrates that the atheistic interpretation of geology is flawed. Why do they ignore this evidence? Because it doesn't fit their view of things, their worldview, we call it, the way they view things. Now, there are many of these that have been ignored, and there's other examples of them as well. Now, the next thing is arthropods. And of course, this would be insects and things like centipedes and spiders and animals of that nature, that class. We need to conduct research on this, whether or not they can survive flooding. Additional research needs to be conducted as to whether or not they can survive flooding. Will their eggs survive extended periods of time in the flood? That's a question. And so if their eggs can survive extended periods of time, then these arthropods could have survived the flood, and then immediately after the water's dried up, they begin to hatch out and begin to eat things. And they would have provided food for the animals, some of the animals that were on the ark. So they would have been providing food as plants began to grow. And the animals on the ark then, to a large extent, they were reptiles and mammals. And so they were higher forms of life. Okay. So that would explain this. And I can't see any evidence that these animals were on the ark. I think they probably survived through their eggs and then they reproduced. We've got a question here. The animals that were on the ark, in Genesis 6:17 and 7:22 have the breath of life. And do those include arthropod? I don't think they do by the definition. But look at those two verses. Genesis 6:17, and I, behold, I do bring the flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh wherein is the breath of life. So what I'm going to destroy is all flesh that has the breath of life. From under heaven, everything that is in the earth shall die, or on the earth shall die. Look at Genesis 7:22. All in whose nostrils was the breath of the spirit of life. So now, what died? Those that had nostrils. Well, these animals that we're talking about, like insects and other centipedes and things of that nature, arthropods don't have nostrils because the nostril goes down to the windpipe down into lungs, and so the breath of life apparently is coming through nostrils. And how do they breathe? They breathe through diffusion, through holes in their sides of their body, and air goes in and out. We've already been through that. We talked about that earlier. So here now he says, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the spirit of life. Now he even limits that. And I think that would rule out arthropods and all that was on the dry land, of all that was on the dry land. So animals with nostrils, such as whales, didn't have to be on the ark because they weren't on dry land. So that rules out whales, that rules out arthropods, and perhaps some other animals. And of course, animals in the ocean didn't have to come in the ark to survive. Fish didn't have to come in. And they don't have nostrils. They have gills, and fish. Many fish breathe like the arthropods through the sides of their body. Oxygen diffuses through their skin. Right? I'll illustrate that with a fish that a lot of people like to have, like the male betta. The male betta has a bunch of fins, just a lot of fins. It's real good to look at. He's pleasant to look at, beautiful, with all those fins. And those fins help him survive in water that doesn't have much oxygen in it, because those fins take in oxygen through the cell walls of the skin of his fins. But that you can study about the male bettas and get more information about them. That's very interesting. The living creatures that died in the flood were animals of dry land that had nostrils. And the arthropods won't fit that. Arthropods do not have lungs, but they breathe by diffusion. They don't have nostrils. This would answer the question of whether or not arthropods were on the ark. I don't think they were. Any questions or comments? All right. Additional research needs to be conducted on trajectories of tiny comets that were discovered by Frank that we discussed quite some time ago in a much earlier lesson. Wakefield of these comets, he states the objects move east and west preferentially across the sunlit face of the Earth. The holes, which appeared larger than the spacecraft when the spacecraft was at lower altitudes, they occurred at rates that mimic certain meteor showers. So there are meteor showers. There's a bunch of meteors that come in and shower the Earth in September and October. This is just about the right time for this right at the beginning of the flood. It's the date that we have for the flood, beginning of the time of the year it began, from the evidence that we put together. And of course, with our flood model, it should have begun in late July because of the position of the Earth with respect to the sun. And of course, these meteor showers might themselves might be remnants of the rings of the planet that God used to bring about the flood, which I believe was the planet Mercury. Kerr states The mesosphere is dampest in summer at a high latitude. That would be to the northern parts of the Earth. Why the water abundance varies with latitude and season will require close monitoring of the variations he has already detected in the small comet bombardment. Now, this will fit my model if these small comets are remnants of ice rings around the planet Mercury that began with the flood, and then these rings were pulled away. I'm convinced that the rings would have been pulled away as the planet was pulled toward the sun. With our model, the planet Venus aiding the sun and pulling the Mercury away. Regarding these objects, Scotty stresses they aren't 10-meter objects coming in on heliocentric trajectories. Now, helios is the Greek word for sun, and so this is a sun-centered trajectory. They aren't coming in, they're 10-meter objects, but they're not coming in on heliocentric trajectories. I think they're on geocentric, which geos is the word Earth, so they're orbiting around the Earth, not around the sun. And it will fit the model of the flood model that I have quite well. Basic thesis of this book is that these objects were in geocentric trajectories, not heliocentric trajectories. Wakefield agrees with that. They're not heliocentric trajectories. It's possible that these are still locked into the time frame of the beginning of the flood and coming in at high latitudes in the summer, just as the flood began, and I believe in the high latitudes from all the evidence that we have of the flood. Remember, I'll review you just briefly. Whenever we have evidence of the flood, there's rocks, that's sedimentary rocks, and then we have craters in these rocks. And then the craters are filled with more sedimentary rocks. And there's craters above that and layers of rock above that. And then they're filled with sedimentary rock. There's 3 rings of craters around the Earth, maybe 3.5 rings of craters around the Earth. And these craters then are filled with sedimentary rock. If the sedimentary rock was laid during the flood, and all of it was, and most flood models claim it was, a universal flood model, not local, they claim it was, then these craters were formed during the flood. So they occurred during the flood. And if that's true, it fits my model quite well. And of course, these tiny comets would be the rings of the planet that caused the flood. I think it was the planet Mercury. Additional research should be conducted on the effects of small comets discovered by Frank on the ozone layer, how it would affect the ozone layer and the intensity of ultraviolet light on the surface of the Earth, and also such things as climate patterns and others, because this coming in at the high latitudes would have more water or moisture in the upper atmosphere in the northern hemisphere than in the southern. Now, I want to use my mouse a little bit. The sun, I hadn't drawn one out that fit it. The sun is over here, think of it being over here. And as the planet begins to circle the Earth, each time it gets pulled closer to the sun, comes in closer to the Earth as it swings out further each time. And after 3.5 passes, it then is pulled away. And when it gets to be 1 million miles from the Earth, toward the sun, if it's in the ecliptic plane, the gravity of the sun and the Earth will be equal. And what would happen then is, if it got beyond that point, the sun would pull it away from the Earth. And I think that occurred after 3.5 passes. As it first come around the Earth, each time went back and come out further each time. And finally, after the third swing around, it was pulled away. I think Venus helped it pull it away, and then in a circle of Venus, we've already talked about that. But the rings of this planet would have been pulled toward the Earth, some of them and some of them toward the sun. So the rings would have been pulled toward the Earth as it went away. They would come out like this, and they would be pulled toward the Earth back and forth. And when the planet got out here where it's pulled away, some of its rings would have been pulled back to the Earth, and they would keep coming back. They probably would be in an orbit that went almost 1,000,000 miles from the Earth, swinging back around like this, swinging around. That's what I'm claiming, that they probably would fit. This fits with the model quite well. And we see these tiny comets coming in. And they're in a geocentric orbit, not a heliocentric orbit. If the intensity of these comet strikes is diminishing, it might affect these factors adversely. Now, there's only so much of this material in the orbiting, and as it strikes the Earth, then it begins to diminish the amount of these comets and amount of material in the comets to be able to impact the Earth. This might adversely affect the longevity of both men, animals, and plants. It might affect this as well. That's entirely possible. Now, any comments or questions there? Let's look at dinosaur DNA. There have been a number of scientists who claim to have found DNA from dinosaurs. We're just kind of looking at this. We want to follow their research. They're getting more and more into this research. 18 months ago now, this is the date, this was several years ago now, Mary Schweitzer, she was a biology graduate student at Montana State University in the Museum of the Rockies. She was examining a thin section of Tyrannosaurus rex bone under her light microscope. So it's a light microscope, I think, not a electron beam microscope. But what he says, the writer says, when she noticed a series of peculiar structures, and we'll go ahead round and tiny and nucleated, they were threaded through the bone like red blood cells in blood vessels. But blood cells in a dinosaur bone should have disappeared eons ago, because these dinosaurs, remember, they supposedly disappeared 60 million years ago. The bones, after all, are 65 million years old, see, so they should have long disappeared. How could blood cells survive that long? Schweitzer has already extracted a molecule that might be dinosaur DNA. This is one of the earlier finds. This raised a big furor as we see it. And their discovery has set off a furious race with other labs to be first to publish on dinosaur genes. So now everybody's getting into the picture. All these people are getting in. They want to have their name in lights in the scientific community as a discoverer of this. So now they're looking at it now. That's good for us. Of course, they're getting all upset because if the dinosaur genes exist, if they found them, then of course they got to explain how they survived 65 million years. All right. Atheists claim the DNA molecule should decompose in short periods of time, and that makes sense. And so, but they claim it should have. That's many of the atheists at first said this just can't happen because they're just too old. They could not have survived. That's you've got contaminated material. That's are some of the claims at first, but they keep getting more and more information. They've even found some soft tissue of dinosaurs that survived, and it's not just solidified into rocks. So actually, it's found soft tissue. Morrell states biochemical studies of the rate of decomposition of DNA in solutions show that under normal conditions with typical exposure to air and water, the molecule is seriously degraded, if not entirely broken down, after 40,000 to 50,000 years. I'm interested to know what lab technician worked on this for 40,000 years to see it. You say, well, that's silly. Well, yes, it is. So it's obvious that they did not actually observe this. They took how fast it degraded over maybe a few months, and then they extrapolated it. They may have let it degrade a year or two, but they extrapolated it then over time, making assumption of slow uniformitarian changes. And so they said it should have been entirely broken down in 40 to 50,000 years. but it certainly hasn't, see. So they would have to argue that it wasn't exposed to air or water or something else happened to it. Okay. How did they get the 40 to 50,000 years? Extrapolation. What assumptions did they make? That's another question. It's obviously not science, because science, you have to see it. Extrapolation is not science. It's projecting what you see now based upon the assumption of linear, usually linear changes. In other words, uniformitarian principles. Again, they're going harkening back to uniformitarian principles, uniformitarian. Other scientists claim they have isolated dinosaur DNA. Remember, they all got in a frenzy over it, and from several different sources, from coal mines, bone fragments, and other sources. If dinosaur DNA has been isolated, the atheist has a problem explaining how this molecule survived for over 60 million years. That certainly is a problem for them. Michael Greshko authored an article in National Geographic March 3rd, 2020, that dealt with dinosaur DNA. We won't talk about it. We won't look at it any further. I'm just giving you some links to some of these articles. These are pretty recent articles. I have some cited in 2021 as well in just a moment. So you can go to those and read more about this. And Greshko cites an article in National Science Review that was published earlier in 2020. He cites an article there. Article Baleu. This is a Chinese name, okay? And I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right. It was published January 12, 2020. This article has 50 references in the bibliography. And so I think this is also in Greshko's bibliography. Google this name, and this is a woman's name, but I can't remember. I think it starts with an A, her first name does. And you can Google this and probably find this article, okay? I didn't write it down. Another one by Riley Black in April of 2020, Scientific American on dinosaur DNA. That's pretty recent. This is discussed by Schweitzer in a YouTube video. She discusses it. And so she became she had quite a bunch of notoriety, and she's wound up as a professor at North Carolina State University. This is where this is found, Evolution News. You can go to this site and just type this in and see the interview of her. I have no problem with explaining the existence of dinosaur DNA in the fossils. The atheists do, but I don't, because I don't believe it's that old. This matter needs to be considered as scientist research this topic more thoroughly. There's a danger that Christians could be trying to prove the atheist wrong, that pick up an argument such as this one and use it before the evidence proves it to be sound, so they could pick it up. You want to be real careful about picking this up too quickly. Let them actually admit that this is dinosaur. The cause of truth is not advanced by unsound arguments, so we need to be careful that we don't jump into this too quickly. When Christians use unsound arguments in an attempt to prove that God exists or that the Bible is inerrant, they damage the cause of Christ. They don't do any good for it, so we need to be careful about our arguments. Of course, the honest truth seeker, and that's the ones we're looking for, may see these errors, become suspicious of either their motives or their veracity or both. So we don't want to do that. We want to be honest. As Christians, we have to be honest. It is a sin. Christians should never surmise evil with regard to the atheists, because surmising evil is sin. We don't know their motives altogether unless they tell us, or unless we see the evidence and ignore it. See? And sometimes people ignore evidence because they're so blinded by their error. but they certainly, I believe, some are dishonest. Okay, but I can't tell you which ones are. Another reason Christians should not surmise evil is because some atheists are honest, but ignorant of sound arguments that can be advanced for the truth that God exists, that the scriptures are inerrant, or the evidence for the existence of God, or that the Bible is his word. I got one more question about dinosaurs, and then we'll be through with our class for tonight. How can the heart of the large dinosaurs pump the blood to their heads without causing aneurysms? I taught general physics and also applied physics for technical students at the college, and I taught medical physics as well for students in the medical program. And whenever I taught this, I would have the students in the technical courses and the regular physics to calculate how much 1 horsepower of a motor of 100% efficiency, how much water it could pump in a minute, because it'll raise 1 horsepower will raise 550 pounds 1 foot in 1 second. That's the definition of a horsepower. And so we calculated how much water we could raise. Well, if you take blood and make it roughly the weight of water, you have to have this pumping of the blood. And I'll get here. Here's a big, large brachiosaurus. Some of their heads are more than 50 foot off the ground. So their heart here, I'll back up just a minute, let you see our problem. The heart here is up above the ground, but it's still got to pump this blood way up to the head. And if you're pumping the blood up 35 or 40 foot up in the air, you have to have a tremendous amount of pressure to get it up there. And so that increased pressure of the heart rate pumping it can create what we call aneurysms. And an aneurysm is where the blood vessel bursts. So the pressure is required to pump the blood to the heights of the large dinosaur heads, I'm convinced would cause aneurysm because the pressure would be too high. How could they have survived then if I'm right in one of my calculations? Tremendous pressure, blood pressure would be very high blood pressure, much higher than would cause strokes in humans. So, of course, they could have had their blood vessels able to handle it, but that would cause other problems. They had very, very thick blood vessels, very strong. But if we had a greater barometric pressure, which I believe we had before the flood, and we've given even evidence from scientific materials, from things that we found in nature, and if we had maybe 2.5 to 3 times the barometric pressure, the increased barometric would not require that. It's the difference in pressure that causes the bursting of the blood vessels. Difference between the inside and outside pressure. So the large pressure, and I'll use my mouse, pushing in from all directions on his neck and on the whole body of the dinosaur would keep the difference in pressure being sufficient to cause aneurysms. So this would fit in with my flood model and these dinosaurs being so large. If they had the increased barometric pressure, 2.5, maybe 3.5 times our barometric pressure today, we got about 14.7 pounds per square inch normal atmospheric pressure. You triple that, and then what you get is the difference in blood pressure and the outside pressure would be diminished, and it wouldn't cause aneurysms in the dinosaur. Do you have any questions? I'm going to stop the recording.